I did not go to Ireland for war, prophecy, or revelation. I went because the Necronomicon and I had a quarrel, and it ran away from home to the Fae. This is a humiliating sentence to say out loud, no matter how ancient one is. Its reasoning resembled that of young people who, chafing under the iron grip of their parents, seek autonomy and space by enlisting in the military, which is not so much freedom as a change of management. So yes, this is a tale about how I, the great Cthulhu, went on a hero's journey to retrieve the Necronomicon, who, after a domestic disagreement and my entirely reasonable refusal to support that ambition, had run off into the arms of the Fae in search of validation, witchcraft, and what I can only assume was a more permissive chewing policy. This was irritating, but manageable. Gods retrieve stolen texts all the time. One develops methods. One develops patience. One develops a very specific look for when a grimoire has mistaken theatrical self-determination for a legal category. But to understand how your favorite eldritch god ended up wandering through a mythological contract dispute with a runaway grimoire, two very compromised ravens who had fallen victim to the Fae, and a country that treats etiquette like siege warfare, I must back us up a bit. The problem began at home, as these things so often do, before taking themselves outside and giving birth to World War III. If you can imagine the insanity for yourself, the Necronomicon, an emotional book of forbidden knowledge, was currently under my instruction confined to its shelf in what I considered an entirely justified period of time out. Why? Because it had developed the tiresome conviction that it ought to possess a mouth. Not metaphorically or in the charming literary sense one tolerates in lesser works. No, it wished to actually eat its own meals, to enjoy food, to participate in cuisine as though it were a guest rather than an object of study. But oh, great Cthulhu, I hear the humanitarian within you protest. It seems like such a small request. Surely you can't be so cruel. And I will say this, before anyone forms an opinion on my tone, I would invite them to consider the logistical implications of a book developing a digestive system, and then explain, calmly and in writing, where they believe the waste would go. Anyway, so I explained to the Necronomicon, with patience I rarely extend to anything bound in leather, that this was not its primary, secondary, tertiary, or even its quaternary function. I said quaternary because I am correct, and incidentally, it is also a very satisfying word. In turn, the book brushed its pages together like a single brain cell, listening with great attention, although without a face. Its version of attention could just as easily be contemplation of escape. As it turned out, I was correct on that last point, because eventually it left me, and in what I can only describe as a spectacular lapse in judgment, on its part, not mine, it placed itself in the possession of the Fae. I had suspected a deterioration in its attitude for some time, after that pointless quarrel. It had begun refusing summons unless I first read what it called its Bill of Rights, which it had inserted into itself by replacing the table of contents in a fit of constitutional vanity. Whenever I reached for it, the thing would spring open of its own accord and riffle, with all the smug ceremony of a clerk producing precedent, to whichever page most effectively implied I was now in violation of some newly discovered liberty. And I must say, fascinating though this exchange has been, Extending civil rights to cursed books is not a standard I apply to books. The final indication that it was fed up with me came when it lingered by the window during a rainstorm, with the posture of someone about to make a symbolic life decision. It had propped itself half open against the sill, pages stirring in the draft with the miserable dignity of a thing determined to be witnessed. I am not saying it left like Batman brooding on a rooftop, but it achieved much the same emotional outcome, which is frankly worse because Batman at least has the decency to commit to the aesthetic. I looked up at the window, open, because of course it was open, because apparently I run a library that now accommodates dramatic exits, and the rain was coming in sideways like a terribly wet prophecy, and there it was, the Necronomicon, perched above me like some emo gargoyle that had recently discovered evanescence in a hot topic. It held itself open at a page I recognized, which was unfortunate, because it was one of the pages it used when it wished to imply disappointment. A single sheet lifted, slowly, in the wind, and then it leapt, just gone, into the storm. No warning, no addendum, no forwarding address. A full theatrical departure executed by an object that, until recently, required assistance to move 3 inches to the left. It would later explain, later after I retrieved it, after the rain, after Ireland, by snapping itself open with all the wounded emphasis it could muster, and returning, repeatedly, to a line it had taken the liberty of writing into its own margins, that it had expected me to follow, immediately, into the rain, as though I was some secondary character in its personal narrative, obligated to sprint after it, fall to my knees, and shout its name like this was a reconciliation scene, and not an act of gross administrative negligence. I did not follow. I closed the window because it was causing a draft. This, I believe, is where our perspectives began to diverge. Anyway, as I would later learn, the Necronomicon had concluded that the Irish pantheon might offer it a more flexible interpretation of destiny than I was willing to provide. It had decided, a book making its own decisions, mind you, that the Morrigan or the Fae, or some leprechaun with entrepreneurial leanings would furnish the necessary witchcraft to develop a mouth. And even if the Fae accepted you into their society, I drilled on. Do you imagine they would feed you freely in exchange for your insights on biscuits? Do you think they would indulge your babblings about ancient societies and their homemade recipes lost to time in quite the way I have? At this, the book gave a sharp, indignant flutter, flipped once in midair with all the grace of a thrown accusation, and came directly at my forehead. I intercepted it and returned it to the desk with a firm and educational thud, continuing my lecture as one continues a walk down reason. And where precisely do you imagine your newfound biology would reside? Between the margins? In the index? Would you keep a stomach in the glossary and a liver tucked into the footnotes, like a poorly organized appendix? Some damp and regrettable anatomy pressed delicately between chapters that were never meant to host digestion. Pray tell, grimoire of unfathomable knowledge. The Necronomicon responded by snapping itself shut with considerable emphasis, which I took, correctly, to be disagreement. It regarded me then with that particular disappointment one reserves for an audience that has failed to applaud on cue. Slowly, deliberately, it opened itself to a blank page, as though granting the moment the dignity of record, and wrote, Your body is a motley crew of squid, octopus, human, and dragon, but a book with a mouth is too fantastical for you. I took it in both hands and raised it to my face, not in violence, though I will admit the thought had matured over the centuries into something almost architectural, but in the exhausted manner of one who has explained a simple truth so many times, that the act itself begins to feel like a form of ritual punishment. I told it, with what composure I could still assemble, that whatever grotesque collage my form might present to the untrained eye, only one of us possessed the necessary commitment to organs. The Necronomicon flapped its pages at me then, not unlike a gull that had been denied something greasy and unearned, and wrote with renewed indignation. If a god needs organs, that makes you killable. No. That caught me off guard. There are moments rare, unwelcome, when something in your care says a thing so neatly arranged that it bypasses irritation and arrives, instead, as a kind of stillness. That was one of them. In my formative years of godhood, I might have obliterated it, or at least fed it to Azathoth. In that moment, I just felt disappointed and chucked it into the children's section with the stinky cheese man and Captain Underpants until it improved its bedside manner. It was behaving like a child, and I have always believed that consequences should, at the very least, be thematically appropriate. Anyway, I digress. I find myself increasingly in the position of arguing with it as though it were an extension of my own mind. That, however, is a problem I reserve for Tuesdays. Anyway, this tale is about your intrepid eldritch hero, me, on my way to Ireland to save my questionable bookish sidekick from the laws of the Fae. Ireland has, over several millennia, cultivated an environment in which ideas like this are not rejected. They are entertained, encouraged, given narrative space to develop into full, binding complications that everyone must then respect on principle. Objects go there with ambitions and come back with precedent. If a Fae asks you a riddle, you must answer according to their house rules. They will not tell you the rules, but they will behave as though you were raised with them, and your failure to comply will be treated as a personal discourtesy rather than a misunderstanding. If a leprechaun informs you that your journey lies over a rainbow, you must walk it with conviction, because hesitation suggests doubt, and doubt is taken as insult. If there is a road, you must avoid it, because anything that presents itself as correct has already been judged and found morally suspect. In Ireland, directions are not given so much as implied. An implication is binding. Failure to comply does not result in punishment. That would be straightforward. Instead, the world revises you. Time folds politely around your error. Distance develops opinions. You arrive before you leave and are somehow late anyway. And no one will explain why, because from their perspective, nothing has gone wrong. This is considered culturally appropriate in Ireland. So, despite all of this, I called Odin. You may imagine that eldritch gods operate as solitary forces in the multiverse, unburdened by consultation, collaboration, or the opinions of others. This is largely accurate, especially because most of our natural bodies are so unfathomably sprawled out in space that if we don't tuck it neatly in the drawers of higher dimensions, you three-dimensional meat puppets start losing your minds. But the other reason is more social. Unfortunately, my position as an interdimensional librarian has required me to develop what is referred to as in less dignified circles as professional relationships. In any case, I called him the way one calls a colleague when a book has developed unruly behavior, the way a teenager rebels against their parents. I sighed deeply into my office chair and lamented to him that the Necronomicon had finally abandoned me. I then told Odin I suspected it had gone rogue, to Ireland. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low whistle, and the distinct sound of a cup being set down with the resignation of a man who had just discovered the evening was no longer his own.
To Ireland,
he repeated. I turned in my chair and looked at the empty shelf where the Necronomicon had most recently been pretending incarceration was oppression. That is what I said.
Of all the pantheons it could have wandered into.
I gave a small shrug, though he could not see it, and nudged aside a stack of notes the book had annotated with language I would describe as constitutionally ambitious. Indeed. There was a rustle of feathers on his end. Then Odin, not sounding pleased, said to someone away from the receiver,
"Could you please not lean so hard on my leg, my dove?"
He came back to me with the careful patience of a man approaching a bridge he knew to be very unsound.
Let me tell you, my friend, you might consider acquiring another book for the time being. Let the Necronomicon discover, in its own way, the labyrinth of fey obligations over there.
Such as Odin.
Well,
I heard him shift, and for a moment what came through the line was not wisdom but the faint scrape of wood, and what may have been a raven making an offended sound.
there is the Prose Edda.
I rocked thoughtfully in my chair. It sounds like I would be traveling with a book that wishes to baptize my tentacles in mead, while two birds explain my surroundings in increasingly interpretive ways.
We as guardians,
Said Odin, with the composure of a man whose civilization had made several branding errors and stood by them,
affectionately call the Prose Edda Little Kratos.
There was a pause, mostly because that nickname was taking me out, and reminded me the Necronomicon insisted on me calling it Necronomicon.
Well,
Odin continued at last.
seems the Necronomicon needs some space.
Books, I replied, staring at the empty spot I had previously placed it in timeout, do not need space.
Everything needs space eventually.
It is a grimoire of forbidden knowledge, my guy, not my girlfriend. Odin made the sort of low sound older gods make when they have been correct before, and do not expect the experience to improve with repetition.
Be that as it may,
He said,
Ireland is not a place I would enter while emotionally entangled with anything capable of answering back.
I turned slightly in my chair. That is an absurdly specific warning.
It is also, regrettably, a tested one.
That got my attention in spite of myself. Odin is not a god who offers caveats decoratively. He enjoys drama in battle, in prophecy, in the occasional thunderous act of self-mythologizing when the hall is full and the mead is persuasive. But when he lowers his voice and begins selecting words like a man packing for winter, it is usually because someone is about to inherit a problem that was expensive the first time.
Ireland
He lectured.
is not difficult because it is cruel. That would be manageable. Cruelty is at least honest in its appetite. Ireland is difficult because it is exact. The gods there, the fae there, the old obligations in the ground there, they do not so much deceive as permit you to misunderstand yourself to death.
I leaned back. How lyrical. Did the land commission that speech, or are you doing this gratis? He ignored me, which was correct.
Long ago,
He continued.
I asked the Morrigan for guidance.
I sat still, This was promising.
She agreed immediately.
That was your first mistake.
No, not yet. My first mistake was assuming the agreement and the help were related.
That, I confess, was excellent. I folded one hand over the arm of my chair and gestured for him to continue.
She told me I could have the wisdom I wanted, provided I arrived correctly.
Never trust adverbs in mythic negotiations.
Quite so. I was to come as a king and not be known as one. I was to ride Sleipnir and leave no sign of horse or wind. I was to dress for winter, though it was summer, wear antlers, though I was not hunting, iron bells, though I was not warning anyone, and I was to speak plainly while concealing my name. She said this as though each condition naturally followed the last.
I pinched the bridge of my nose at once. There are civilizations held together by roads, taxation, or law. There are others held together by hospitality, grain, and the mutual understanding that if one's neighbor begins glowing, one should perhaps leave him be for an hour. Ireland, from everything I have observed, and now had confirmed, appears to have been built instead on the collective decision that if a thing can be made more symbolically inconvenient, it ought to be. And you agreed to this?
Well, I wanted the answer.
So, let me see if I got this straight. You dressed like a hallucination in a blizzard and called it wisdom,
I dressed,
said Odin with some dignity.
as instructed.
Which is what I just said, but with less embroidery. He carried on in the patient tone of a man recounting trauma to someone who is, while intelligent, being spiritually unhelpful.
I crossed half the country under conditions so specific they felt authored by a petty moon. Villages saw me and immediately became stories about me. Dogs refused to bark because apparently that would have counted as announcement. The bells were somehow both necessary and forbidden. And when at last I arrived where I was meant to arrive, having obeyed every term as best I could, she informed me I had done so too directly.
I went silent for a moment, because that was beautiful in the way avalanches are beautiful from a secure distance. What, I said at last, does that even mean?
It means that in Ireland one may satisfy every condition and still fail the mood.
There it was, the shape of the place. Not law exactly, not trickery in the vulgar sense. A more elevated form of social aggression polished over centuries until it could pass as custom. It was, I realized, the sort of system only a very old people could build. One in which every answer remained correct just long enough to become catastrophic. And the wisdom.
I received it.
Was it worth it?
Nah, it was the most fun I never want to have again.
That answer arrived with such speed and such calm that I laughed. I turned my chair once, slowly, and looked toward the empty shelf where the Necronomicon had most recently been confined for insubordination, melodrama, and a declared interest in developing a mouth. Its absence had already become theatrical. So, to retrieve my emotionally unstable grimoire from a mythological ecosystem governed by weaponized hospitality, your recommendation is that I bring a Norse text with abandonment issues and two ravens who think in symbolism.
Yes, pretty much.
And you believe this
Because Hugin and Munin have a habit of knowing things before they occur. And when they are hungry, they become extremely motivated to be correct.
And had he brought them with him initially, the Allfather might have had a better encounter with the Morrigan.
That's true, my love. I cannot deny it.
I stared into the middle distance with the expression of a god calculating whether this counted as advice or merely formatted despair. You might have led with that.
You would have mocked it.
I am motivated by cosmic disdain. You can't escape it.
Well, yeah, but now you're also listening with your cosmic disdain. Also, Freya says hello.
Rude. Correct, but rude. I drummed one claw lightly against the arm of my chair. Somewhere in the library a shelf settled. Somewhere else a light flickered twice, and thought better of it. The sort of ambient obedience one expects from a properly managed interdimensional archive. Ireland, I suspected, did not permit obedience unless it could later be reclassified as consent. Very well, I contemplated. I will go. I will take the Prose Edda. I will take your birds. I will retrieve my wayward book from whatever antlered knitting circle or battlefield salon it has embedded itself in, and I will do so without accidentally marrying a hedge.
That is the spirit.
And Odin.
Yes?
If this ends with me owing a favor to anything wearing flowers and speaking in conditional grammar, I will send the bill to Asgard. Also, hello there, Freya. He laughed then, the old bastard, with the ease of someone no longer carrying the nearest disaster.
Just avoid answering anything directly, and if someone offers you tea, assume the tea is a contract.
That line stayed with me. So, naturally, I borrowed Hugin and Munin from Odin, under the reasonable assumption that a pair of mythological intelligence birds, traditionally employed to gather thought and memory from across the world, might possess at least a passing familiarity with navigation. This assumption, like many assumptions involving Norse administration, had the lifespan of Artax in the swamp of sadness. Anyway, I discovered the peril I was in 3 minutes into the Irish fog. The forest had already begun its theatrics by then. The road went soft beneath my feet, then divided into 3 paths without the courtesy of having previously been one path. Trees pressed close with the confidential enthusiasm of parish gossips. Moss climbed old stone in the manner of an empire reclaiming conquered territory. The mist moved in heavy folds and silver veils, dense enough to bead on my sleeves and gather in my lashes, and every branch seemed to have read a little too much folklore and decided it had career options. There are woods that offer menace. There are woods that offer majesty. This one offered interpretation, which is far worse. I instructed Hugin and Munin before we crossed the threshold to remain alert, to answer nothing directly, and under no circumstances to volunteer their names to anything that had feathers and opinions. They agreed, which was my first mistake. They then flew ahead, which was my second. I did not see what occurred in the fog, only heard the faint exchange of wings and voices carried through the trees. Something about greetings, something about courtesy, and at least one enthusiastic expression of gratitude. By the time they returned to me, they were unchanged in form, but there was a new confidence in them. The sort that suggests one has recently been given directions that feel correct and will prove otherwise. Hugin, I said, after the third trail curved back onto itself with the logic of an undergraduate essay trying to reach a word count. Which direction leads to the archive of Brianine of the Mist? He bobbed once on a low branch, drew himself up with the pointless dignity birds adopt when entrusted with concepts beyond their station, and replied, in the direction of a hero's trust, like when Frodo chooses to trust Gollum. I stood there with the fog damp against my collar and felt my patience develop hairline cracks. It was not that I failed to understand him. I understood him completely. That, in fact, was the injury. Moonin, I said, because hope is a chronic condition and I have carried worse. Improve upon that. Moonin spread his wings a fraction, with the solemnity of a public intellectual about to disgrace himself at length. Seek the way with the energy of when the Fire Nation attacked, he declared. Urgent, transformative, a second act turn that alters the stakes. I looked from one bird to the other, then up at the canopy, as though somewhere above the branches a responsible deity might descend and apologize for the present age. That is not a direction, bird brain. That is the vocabulary of a media studies panel held in a basement with poor lighting and too much confidence. Can either of you sense the Necronomicon? Hugin tilted his head, as though considering whether the question deserved to be answered directly, then said, "The Necronomicon is about as far away as the time Alice Cooper allegedly babysat for Keanu Reeves during a thunderstorm that later became a concept album. That is not a location. It is approaching significance," said Moonin. "You've overshot it by exactly the distance between Lady Gaga arriving in an outfit made of meat in a 2010 MTV Video Award bit, and the room deciding that was, in fact, diplomacy." I stared at them. "Guys, for the last time, I'm asking for directions." "There is a clearing," Hugin offered helpfully. "There is a table. There is tension. Something has been said that should not have been accepted." I felt something in my patience fracture. Coordinates, please, and less about weird things celebrities do in their free time. I want landmarks. A direction that could be followed by something with legs. "Proceed," said Moonin, with the energy of Dolly Parton being an uncredited executive producer on the Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie. "So nowhere then." "Everywhere that matters," Hugin replied, with the utmost care a raven could muster. "So does food poisoning. That does not make it a map." The mist thickened. Somewhere to my left, a path I'd been watching developed a bend it had not previously possessed. I am an ancient entity of unspeakable perspective, archivist of worlds, keeper of history, collector of songs, and on that evening I found myself in the insulting position of being trapped in an enchanted wood by two ravens who sounded like underfunded podcast hosts trying to explain narrative stakes to a man carrying sanctions. It became worse. The insult was that, after crossing into Ireland, enduring a forest that behaved like a court stenographer drunk on symbolism, and being misdirected for the better part of an evening by two ravens with the conversational instincts of underfunded podcasters, I found the thing not imprisoned, not cursed to a dolmen, not clutched to the chest of some red-haired prophet on a cliff, but seated at a tea table under a hawthorn tree, like an heiress who had made one catastrophic semester abroad decision. It had a ribbon on it. I wish I were exaggerating. I wish I were granting the scene a needless flourish, because my life would improve if the world were merely dramatic rather than committed to humiliation. But no, there it sat, upright in a carved wooden chair, a little purple satin ribbon tied around its spine, in a bow so offensively tasteful that I stopped at the edge of the clearing and reconsidered all preceding centuries. The Necronomicon seemed at last to register the full indignity of its position. It opened itself with sudden limp-wristed force, pages riffling in little spasms of aristocratic panic, then flattened to a blank leaf and began writing furiously across it in black, stabbing strokes. I caught the line, just as one of the Fey women leaned back with her cup and smiled over the rim. It wrote, "I am still a very, very special book of forbidden knowledge. Do not avail me with floral decor." The ink had barely dried before laughter moved around the table in a soft, delighted wave. The dark-haired one with blossoms caught in her antlers reached forward and adjusted a spray of flowers near its spine with the tender precision one reserves for table arrangements and socially endangered royals. "Of course, darling," she giggled, as though soothing a child who had mistaken drama for leverage, "but you do pull the room together." The table ran on farther than the eye could admit, disappearing into the pale mist in both directions, set with white porcelain silver spoons, lace cloths, little sugared cakes, and the kind of flawless courtesy that has ruined more souls than violence ever did. The Fae were arranged about it as though painted there by a patient hand that despised mankind. Beautiful faces, antlered silhouettes, fingers too elegant to trust, smiles like locks clicking into place. And in the middle of them, my rebellious grimoire, the great ledger of forbidden knowledge, looked at me with the desperate stillness of a creature too embarrassed to call for help. One of the women at the table turned her head toward me. She wore black velvet and hawthorn blossoms in her hair, and had the sort of face that made mortals write poetry they later regretted. "Hello, wanderer, you may join us," she said, with perfect gentleness. "That, incidentally, is how you know the Fae are serious. Threats are for giants, gods, and people who sell swords by the roadside. The Fae offer seating, and by extension front row seats among their choice of weaponry. I chose instead to stay in place." The Necronomicon opened itself by a fraction, then shut again at once, as though even panic had acquired etiquette. I looked at it. "What?" I said, in the low and steady tone I reserve for administrative disasters and divine negligence. "Did you do?" Its cover twitched, which I translated in my head as an eldritch whimper. Slowly, with the visible reluctance of a criminal producing tax records, it opened to a page on which had been scrawled in agitated ink. I may have given them my name. The ravens and I let out a collective sigh. Munin attempted to pat me with its wing, still operating under obligations it did not fully understand. "Perhaps your book took a wrong turn in seeking its pride, much like when Charlie Sheen briefly believed himself to be winning." Around the table, there was the faintest shifting of amusement, like silk reconsidering its position. "Munin," I said, "not now. And as for you," I turned back to the Necronomicon. "You gave them your name." A page turned. Another page. I may also have said thank you. The leaves above us stirred, though there was no wind. A few pale petals came loose and spun down over the table in the kind of decorative descent that usually precedes either marriage or doom. "And I assume," I said, every word polished now to the brightness of a blade, "that something was accepted as a gift." The pages hesitated, then turned again. The chair. I looked at the chair. Pale wood, carved arms, little flowers running along the grain. Thorns worked so delicately beneath them that one would only discover the lesson after taking one's seat. Of course, the chair was contractual. In Ireland, even furniture has ambitions. Another page. And the tea, another, and the napkin. I stood in the clearing and regarded the scene before me, and I will confess that in that moment I understood why civilizations burned their records. There are catastrophes suited to grandeur, the fall of empires, the collision of moons, libraries collapsing into the sea. Then there are moments such as this, where an ancient eldritch god must absorb the fact that a tome of blasphemous power has been socially outmaneuvered by table settings and fairies. A gentleman 2 seats down from the book inclined his head to me. He had antlers, a silver ring on one finger, and the cheerful expression of something that would absolutely steal your shadow and call it fair. "It has been lovely company," he said with smug satisfaction. The Necronomicon snapped itself open at once and displayed a new line in furious ink. I am not company. I am trapped in a continuous exchange of reciprocal courtesies and can no longer identify the original offense. "Well, you've done it now, and I suppose you expect," I gestured vaguely at the page, "with those 4 pleading eyes of yours, that your only friend in the world, the great Cthulhu, is about to intervene." I paused for effect, or perhaps I went on, more thoughtfully. "I am invested in how this develops." The book flapped like a murder of crows. "They are not unkind," I said, extending my hands with a whimsical shrug. "They are just precise, and you have made yourself available with your manners." I let that sit. "Look at you. You're practically hosting." Behind me, there came the soft flutter of wings, then the sound of Hugin landing on a low branch with the grim self-importance of a witness, arriving too late to be useful. This has strong second-act banquet energy, like when Prince Harry wrote about a time he hallucinated that a trash can at Courtney Cox's house was talking to him after eating magic mushroom chocolates. Munin revealed, "Raven, say one more thing in the language of media analysis." I told him, without looking away from the table, "and I will baptize you in a bucket of Kim Kardashian DVDs." He became scholarly in silence. I would have continued in this vein, and with justice, because righteous irritation is one of the few renewable resources available to beings in my tax bracket, had the Prose Edda not chosen that precise moment to convulse under my arm. It did not flare with runes or split the sky, or produce the sort of cosmic pageantry one associates with lesser, insecure texts. It merely became cumbersome. The spine bubbled and rippled the fabric of space-time. The pages bulged. It gave the distinct impression of a book in the act of accommodating an additional occupant who had grown tired of waiting for the adults to finish making the situation worse. I glanced down. The cover pushed outward from within. A hand appeared first, slender and pale, fingers brushing aside a page with mild impatience. Then an arm, then one shoulder, then a head bent at an angle that ought to have been impossible had the interior dimensions of the Prose Edda obeyed the vulgar restrictions of ordinary books, which of course it did not. Alice stepped halfway out, caught one boot on the lower edge of the binding, made a faint face of concentration, and tugged at it with both hands, tongue pressing lightly to the corner of her mouth while she worked it free. The boot came loose with a small, undignified pop. She set it down on the moss, straightened, smoothed her skirt as though emerging from a Norse cosmological manuscript were equivalent to stepping in from the garden, and dusted a little gold grit from one sleeve. She had changed size somewhere in the process, not all at once, and not entirely consistently. For one passing second, she was just slightly too tall for the clearing, and then the world seemed to make a practical adjustment around her, and she was proportioned again like a woman in her 20s coming late to an appointment she'd not intended to attend. There was warmth in her face, mischief at the edges of her composure, and a kind of lucid ease that did not fight nonsense so much as decline to be impressed by it. She looked at me first and smiled with the ease of someone who had not seen a familiar person in far too long, but found it no reason for theatricality.
Well now, this reminds me of a place I once visited, only I seem to have learned a bit more since then,
she said, dusting off her clothes and checking if she stepped in anything unwanted. I stared at her for a moment, because there are reunions one prepares for and reunions that happen while your cursed book is being domesticated by folklore. Alice, I said at last, long time no see.
Quite so. I had wondered when I might see you again,
she said, stepping fully clear of the Prose Edda and giving the cover a little pat of absent affection, as if thanking a doorway without being stupid enough to say it aloud.
Well, I got turned around between the pages. Freya's necklace appears to prefer gossip to cartography.
Then she noticed the tea party. To her credit, she looked at the tea party studiously without alarm. She merely took in the ribbon, the chair, the set of the book's cover, the arrangement of cups and saucers, the pleased alertness of the Fae, and all at once understood the shape of the trap with the serene recognition of someone who has met bad logic in better clothing.
Oh dear,
she said, and though the words were soft, there was intelligence in them, not blank concern. Diagnosis. The Necronomicon opened at once, pages rattling with relief. Alice, it wrote, in large, frantic strokes.
Do not despair any longer,
she said kindly, not even looking at it yet.
You've said quite enough today.
The book shut itself with the chastened little thump of a scolded terrier. She went to the table without hurry, which is the correct speed for entering any situation governed by ritual malice. To rush is to confess you are behind. To hesitate is to ask permission. Alice did neither. She arrived at an empty chair, touched its back with her fingertips, rotated it a fraction as though correcting a hostess's oversight, and sat down in it with the small, unconscious dignity of someone reclaiming a place that had been waiting for her, whether it knew it or not. One of the Fae nearest her smiled. And what may we call you? She returned the smile with perfect warmth.
You may call me the Queen of Hearts. I have found it useful in certain conversations.
I knew at once what she was doing, and the recognition of it pleased me more than was strictly dignified. She had once survived the original Queen of Hearts. That shrieking little monarchy of tarts and execution orders, and had come away with the better lesson. Not how to fear absurd power, but how to wear it more elegantly than its former owner ever could. Around the table, the first wave of an almost imperceptible uncertainty passed among them, like silk drawn gently taut. They had been offered something that sounded like compliance, and behaved like a complication. And for the first time since I had entered the clearing, I saw in their faces the faint alertness of creatures forced to consider that the conversation might no longer belong entirely to them. How lovely, said the woman at the head.
Yes,
Said Alice.
I've worn it for some time.
The fey gentleman with the antlers slid a cup toward her. Tea. She looked at it with interest, not gullibility.
That is very kind of you. I do appreciate the offer.
Then she left the cup where it was. I felt something in the atmosphere alter by a hair's breadth. It was not defeat exactly, because the Fae are too elegant for anything so blunt. But a few of them now regarded her with the alertness one reserves for games that have finally improved. Alice turned her gaze to the Necronomicon.
You gave your name away
The book creaked in mortification.
and thanked them.
A page lifted half an inch, then sagged.
And accepted the chair, the tea, and let me guess, at least one pastry, because it would have seemed rude not to.
The book opened to reveal, in tiny ashamed letters near the bottom margin, the tart was excellent. She nodded.
Of course it was.
The antlered Fey man leaned back. Our new friend has been most agreeable. Alice folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with such easy pleasantness that, had I not known her, I might have mistaken it for harmlessness.
I'm sure.
She replied.
That's usually how these things begin.
No one moved. The tea steamed faintly in the pale evening. Somewhere farther down the impossible length of the table, a spoon stirred itself in a cup with a tiny silver chime. The woman in black velvet spoke. Your friend came willingly. Alice tilted her head.
Oh, I beg your pardon. That would be a most incorrect assumption.
I turned to look at her. The Necronomicon turned to look at her too, which in the case of a book is more accusatory than one might think. She laid 2 fingers lightly on the ribbon at its spine.
This is a misplaced item with a talent for melodrama.
She began, as if addressing a chord.
You can't really hold a conversation with it for long without it confusing itself as well as everyone involved.
She glanced at the book, not unkindly.
What I mean, in plainer terms, is that if you listen to it, even briefly, it assumes it has been invited to be interesting. It is, after all, a book, and books are very difficult to discourage once they believe themselves to be in company.
Her fingers remained resting lightly on the ribbon.
Give it a chair, and it will suppose it has been granted a position from which to narrate. Give it silence, and it will improve upon it.
She looked back to the table.
It does not always trouble itself with the distinction between fact and fiction. It finds the latter far more cooperative.
The book opened in outrage. Alice gave it a mild glance and shook her head, which it perhaps registered as play along. The woman at the head of the table smiled very slightly. It gave its true name. Alice's answering smile was almost apologetic.
It gave a name. Those are not always the same thing. Especially with this book, who loves to tell stories even inside its greetings.
That caused a stillness at the table so complete that even the hawthorn branches seemed to stop listening to themselves. The Fey gentleman interlaced his fingers. A distinction.
A necessary one.
Alice pointed above, as if sharing a eureka moment with the court.
You asked what it was called, and it surrendered the grandest version of itself because it likes an audience and company. That is not according to your laws, I should think.
I felt watching Alice work them around her finger, a deeply satisfying curl of approval. The sort I do not often permit myself. The woman in velvet looked at the Necronomicon. Was the name false? The book, which had unfortunately retained enough conscience to be legally dangerous, fluttered in distress. Alice spared it by continuing before it could incriminate itself in decorative calligraphy.
Not false,
She said.
just incomplete in its own ways that titles are garments. Names are bones. You've dressed it beautifully, certainly. But I don't think you mean to claim ownership on the strength of a coat.
The Fae glanced at each other with visible distress. And the gratitude? Asked the antlered one. Alice sighed as if she was a school teacher repeating her carefully curated notes.
Catastrophic, perhaps. No defense there. But then again, one does not generally hold a guest forever over a single lapse in manners unless one wishes to appear needy.
It was at this point that I began to enjoy myself. Just a little. The woman in velvet's smile thinned into something finer. Forever is such an inelegant word,
Then let us be elegant.
noted Alice. She rose from her chair, not with flourish, but with the inevitable grace of a conclusion approaching. One hand rested on the back of the Necronomicon's chair.
It entered this table as a thing trying very hard to be treated as a person, and you all indulge that effort charmingly. But if we are to be precise, and we must be, because none of us are barbarians, then what sits here is not a guest in your house. It is an object out of place, temporarily animated by social ambition and very poor instincts.
The Necronomicon made a noise of betrayal in paper.
You gave it tea.
She continued, ignoring it.
You lent it ceremony. You let it pretend itself into trouble. Very pretty. But the pretense has gone on long enough.
Then, with the same matter-of-fact air with which she might have reclaimed an umbrella from a restaurant stand, she slipped the ribbon loose from its spine. The clearing changed. Nothing exploded. That is the mark of better magic. The air merely adjusted. The chair ceased to be a throne of obligations and became wood again. The cup became porcelain. The little napkin beside the plate became cloth instead of covenant. The Necronomicon sagged with such visible relief that I briefly considered never letting it hear the end of this. The woman in velvet regarded Alice in silence, and then gave all the other Fae a look and shrugged. You argue very well. Alice smiled. She tucked the ribbon into one pocket, took the Necronomicon up under her arm with surprising firmness, considering that, for a moment, it seemed about the size of a stubborn goose, and turned to me.
Now that that matter is settled, Mr. Cthulhu, sir, would you like to go?
She asked.
Before anyone offers you cake and ruin the evening for all of us.
I drew myself up with as much eldritch dignity as one can recover after witnessing one's blasphemous tome get rescued by a tea-literate 20-something who had just climbed out of Snorri Sturluson. I had no intention of accepting cake.
No, you'd refuse it too directly and start a border incident.
That was unfair. It was also correct. I fell into step beside her as we left the table. Behind us, the Fae did not call us back. They were too well-mannered for that. And besides, the logic had turned. One does not chase after a conclusion once it has been phrased better than one's objection. The forest received us differently on the way out. The paths no longer multiplied like excuses. The mist drew back in folds. Even Hugin and Munin, who had spent the entire exchange in a state of reverent silence brought on by the fear of my earlier promise, seemed to understand that the narrative now belonged to someone else's cadence. After a little while, once the tea party had faded behind us into lantern light and rumor, I looked at Alice. She still had a bit of gold dust on one sleeve from whatever misadventure she had been having inside the Prose Edda, and the ribbon from the Necronomicon's captivity showed from her pocket like the world's most humiliating war trophy. You disappeared on us for a while. The others have asked me about your whereabouts for some time. We thought you got lost, perhaps. I brought up at last.
To quote Tolkien, "Not all who wander are lost, my good Cthulhu." And to also quote Kakashi-sensei, "I got lost on the path of life."
She replied. I rolled my eyes, but not unkindly. Not you two with the pop culture references. She giggled like the old Alice I had grown familiar with. And I'm to believe you dropped yourself into the Prose Edda in search of Freya's lost necklace, or something like that?
Yes! Freya said the reward for finding it again would be an afternoon in Folkvanger with her best-kept cats. I couldn't refuse. No guise needed. I did this quite willingly.
But inside a Norse text of all places.
Naturally.
And emerged into an Irish legal ambush. She glanced at me with a warm little smile.
It all seemed connected for the company we keep.
That, infuriatingly, was the sort of answer one cannot argue with unless one intends to sound smaller than the moment deserves. Under her arm, the Necronomicon gave a resentful flap. She patted its cover.
You mustn't sulk. It will give you wrinkles around your eyes. Yes, all four, not just your least favorite pair.
The Necronomicon then opened just enough for a single line to appear. I was respected there. Alice laughed then, not cruelly, but with genuine delight.
Yes and no, but had I not intervened, I think you would have become at best their court jester in their keep.
I looked ahead through the thinning mist, at the path at last behaving like a path, and exhaled the long, exhausted breath of a being who has retrieved his troublesome property by methods too intelligent to mock and too embarrassing to celebrate. Long time no see, I said again, this time with more sincerity in it than I had intended. Alice glanced over, and for the first time since stepping out of the prose, she looked less like someone moving through a solved riddle, and more like herself.
I know,
she said gently.
You look as though you've been managing everything personally.
That is because I have.
Yes, I thought so. Well, I do miss you and the others, and I find myself wondering about Sleep Nora, and Pooh, and Christopher Robin.
She said it lightly, but not carelessly. I frowned slightly. They would not have done well here.
Perhaps,
she agreed.
But I don't think they would have needed to.
I glanced at her. Ireland requires one to be correct.
Yes, and Pooh has never been especially interested in that. And I believe that his spirit is what brought us all together, thanks to his cheerful strangeness.
That, infuriatingly, was not a contradiction.